All right. So, what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be looking at the history of the area around the Mediterranean Sea. We're going to start at around the mid 200s and we're going to work our way all the way up to 1450 ish. What we're going to start with is this event called the Crisis of the Third Century. All right, so the crisis of the third century happens toward near the end of the Roman Empire. Uh, in the current state, it's in disarray. The empire is near collapse almost, and this is mostly because of two primary factors. One being a debased currency. So the emperors at the time wanted to make more money, so what they did was they inflated the currency by releasing a surplus of coins that were diluted with bronze and copper, which are cheaper than the metals that they were currently using in the coins at the time. As a result, these coins kind of lost their value, and the currency just started meaning less and less as a result. Also, they were fighting on two fronts. They were fighting Persians who were coming in from the east, and then barbarians who were coming in from the north through Germany. So at this point, everything seems like it's going to crap. The Romans are in disarray. Everyone has money that doesn't mean anything, and they're fighting groups of people that are spread out way more than they can handle. So this kind of continues in this state of crisis until 285, when Diocletian comes in and stabilizes Rome and splits it into the east and the west. So once he splits the empire, Diocletian takes the west side and Emperor Constantine takes the east side. And from this, we see a revitalization of Roman culture in ways that we had never really seen before. The West and the East kind of separate in terms of like their languages and like the different cultures that are around them, because Rome in this point is becoming even more and more of like a mixing pot society. So a lot of this diversity that we're seeing is because there's a lot of Germanic tribes that are kind of coming into Rome and integrating into its society. And as a result, we start to see provinces pop up, whether it be like provinces from barbaric tribes to the north, or whether it be like tribes of Christians that are congregating around each other. So, one of the major reasons that we see these Christian tribes starting to form is because of Emperor Constantine. When Emperor Constantine comes into the picture, he has a military victory which he attributes to the Judeo Christian God, and therefore he begins to integrate Christianity as like a legitimate religion within the binds of Rome, within the confines of Rome. So from this, we get the Edict of Milan, and this is the official like edict that legitimizes Christianity as a religion in Rome. And from this, we start to see a lot of the people in Rome following suit. A general trend that we see is that whenever the ruling party starts to take a new religion, a lot of the upper class will take it as well, just to follow suit and be on the same page as the emperor at the time. So, one thing to keep in mind is that Emperor Constantine is actually the emperor in the Eastern Empire, but Diocletian is the emperor in the Western Empire. But one thing that you should remember about Diocletian is Diocletian loves cabbages. Diocletian actually loves cabbages so much he decides, I don't want to be an emperor anymore. I just want to grow cabbages. And that's what he does. So Diocletian's done. He's off growing cabbages. But unfortunately, the people that come after aren't as good at regulating power, holding on to it, and they start to fight. And as a result of this, the Western Empire actually fractures into like kingdoms. So, Western Empire shattered into pieces, all at the hands of a multi-leaf vegetable. So you're probably asking, well, okay, how's the Eastern Empire doing? Well, they're doing pretty good. They actually sort of rebrand into what we call the Byzantine Empire. So the primary reason that we see this happen is because once Constantine is the only emperor left, once the West is gone, he moves the capital from Rome to Constantinople, or at the time, Byzantium. This is where we get this idea of like the Byzantine Empire. So when we see this emergence of the Byzantine Empire, we start to get this idea that it might not be so dissimilar to the old Roman Empire itself. We see a lot of similarities, such as like taxation. Uh, Byzantium has its own standing army, and then this idea that the emperor is both a ruler in a military sense, but also a religious sense. So from this like new Byzantine Empire, we start seeing this movement called iconoclasm. And iconoclasm is this idea of destroying icons. Now, icons are like religious imagery, usually like pictures of Mary or Jesus or like saints. And with this idea came people who would like venerate these items or objects. But a lot of people didn't like this. They basically say that it was some form of idolatry, and thus we have iconoclasts. So we have a lot of iconoclast movements that come out of the 8th and 9th centuries, and a lot of this was at the hands of these Byzantine empires who had become religious leaders, and therefore were trying to make like a holier nation. But they'd also use this as an opportunity to like take out people that they didn't like or had problems with at the time, all under this guise of making a holy nation that is better as a result. In addition to these like emergence of Christian traditions and the iconoclastic movement, even before this, we start to see the shaping of Islam. And this is a result of Muhammad. Muhammad was a man who was born in 570 AD and he died in 632 AD. And he becomes kind of like this figurehead for the Islamic movement. And from this movement that starts with Muhammad, we have something called the five pillars of faith. And these are like core essential values to Islam that are essential parts of what they do and why they do what they do. So these pillars are fasting during Ramadan, a profession of faith, a pilgrimage to Mecca, praying 5 times a day, and tax for the sake of charity. Now, aside from creating this new religion that has these principles, Muhammad, also created this unity among Arabs in a way that people can connect with one another in ways that they couldn't before. Because no matter where you go, as long as you're a Muslim and you practice the same things, then you'll have something in common. And that kind of unifies people in a way that they hadn't been able to be unified before. So at this point, Judaism had been around for a very long time. And then even less than that, Christianity had been around for a bit. But Muslims recognized a lot of similarities between these two religions that already existed. And therefore, they gave Christians and Jews like special status called like people of the book. And this was like a recognition of them as religions that practiced things in a similar way with similar ideals. So up through the 6th century, the Pope was nothing more really than like the Bishop of Rome. And the kind of power that he held was kind of like ambiguous to a lot of people. But starting in like the 7th and 8th centuries, we saw a shift in the role of the Pope. And this was largely due to the fact that Pope Gregory the Great started to lay foundations for like a rise in papal power. And then the papacy started to like ally itself with the Franks. Now, the reason that this alliance with the Franks matters so much is because the papacy is trying to break away from Byzantium. And in order to do that, they rely on the Franks to support them when they make this breakaway. As a result of this, Christianity starts to break away from its eastern roots and starts to settle in the west with the Franks and the different kingdoms that are there at the time. All right, so now we're going to kind of transition to this time period from around like 750 to 900 AD. This marks the end of late antiquity and when we start getting to like really the heart of what we call the early Middle Ages. So it's in this time period that we start to see a lot of big changes. Some of those big changes happen in Byzantium. In Byzantium, we see Empress Irene calls for the Second Council of Nicaea in 787. And from this council, we sort of see the end of iconoclasm, or or at least it's supposed to be, because it picks up back again in 815 AD, anyways. So that kind of lasts until 843 when it starts to die down again. It wasn't nearly as big of like an issue as it was primarily, but we do see it reemerge after it's like condemned by this council. We also see the emergence of the Tagmata, and the Tagmata is like, sort of like a crack police force that kind of comes out of Byzantium and kind of strengthens and bolsters the power of the emperor. And from this, we start to see Byzantium expand, and they take back the Balkan Peninsula. This kind of creates like an awkward split between people who speak Greek and Slavic, and that kind of split still like exists to this day and is still kind of a problem. Now, aside from the religious changes and the military changes, we also see changes in like education. We sort of see like a cultural renaissance start to happen within Byzantium and then also in Slavic lands like outside. A lot of this comes from Greek missionaries, namely Cyril and Methodius. They're sent out in 863 to kind of missionize the Slavs. Now, from these missionaries, we actually see a translation of the Gospels into the Slavic language, and that has become what we now call today Old Church Slavonic. And this allows the people to read it in like their native tongue and gives them like much more of access they wouldn't really have otherwise had. Now, stepping away from Byzantium, we kind of shift our focus back over to Islam, and we see this group called the Abbasids. And the Abbasids kind of invade the Middle East and take over from the Umayyad caliphs. And this is around 750. And when they do this, they move the capital from Damascus to Baghdad. Now, under the new ownership of the Abbasids, we see that it actually starts to flourish. They begin to start doing like widespread trading. This goes as far as like imports from China. So while this place is like flourishing, we actually see the Umayyad caliphs kind of flee to the Iberian Peninsula, and this is where we get this idea of Al-Andalus. Al-Andalus is like a melting pot society of now like Muslims, Christians, and Jews. And once the Umayyads have like kind of taken over, from this place we actually see like a sort of cultural renaissance that inspires a lot of like the religious works, translations, and art that we see like throughout the rest of the known world. At this point, we're going to start transitioning into the time period between 900 AD and 1050 AD, and this marks the end of the early Middle Ages and the start of the High Middle Ages. Now, by the time we get to 900 AD, Byzantium has grown into like this huge empire that has like a huge variety of cultures and different languages that are thriving throughout it. While Byzantium is thriving, we see the emergence of this group called the Dynatoi. And these are wealthy landowners that come from the countryside who are kind of resisting this concept of like a centralized Byzantine authority. It is also at this point that we see the last of these groups who have not converted to some kind of monotheistic religion start to become converted. So groups that are like out in East Central Europe or some of the like the further barbaric kingdoms are converting to Islam or Judaism or Christianity in some form. Now, while we had previously mentioned that this group called the Abbasids were thriving in the Middle East, actually by this point they're starting to fall out of power. By 1000 AD, the economy is kind of just shot just because of so many revolts and civil wars that have kind of been going on. Also, at this time, we start to see groups like the Vikings and Hungarians and Muslims start to invade Europe. This primarily happens in the 10th century, and they're just causing like so much chaos in the all of Europe. But eventually, they just start integrating with Europe instead, and we start to see this blend of these invaders with the people who are currently living there. Now, while a lot of these political powers are starting to like restructure, we start to see the emergence of lord and vassal relations not only like starting but like flourishing in this time of like political confusion. Now, from this point of chaos that's kind of going with all this restructuring of political power, we see the emergence of two different dynasties in Europe. In Germany, the German aristocrats have like overthrown the Carolingian kings with this Ottonian dynasty. And in France, we have this guy named Hush Capet. And in 987, he ushers in the Capetian dynasty. Okay, so now we're going to transition to this time called the High Middle Ages. This is about from 1000 AD to 1350 AD. And the big like event, like the main draw of this time period is the Crusades. Now, originally, a lot of the Muslims lived in harmony with Christianity and Christians. They would tax them, but as long as Christians paid their taxes, everything went fine. But then we started to see this shift towards like suppression of Christians, and then we actually saw this kind of come to like a peak in the Battle of Manzikert, which was a battle between Byzantium and the Seljuk Turks. And the Seljuk Turks really just destroyed Byzantium. It was a huge loss and kind of left them like economically crippled in a lot of ways. So in response to this start of like, or at least perceived rise in like Muslim suppression, Pope Urban II calls for the First Crusade in 1095 AD. And this was supposed to like rally all of Europe under like this common idea against this common enemy to retake the Holy Land and stop like the Muslim oppressors. Now, by all accounts, this first crusade was actually fairly successful. Everyone seemed to really rally together, and they're like, "Yeah, yeah, let's get them. Let's get the Muslims, retake the Holy Land. You know, for Jesus, for Christendom." And there's a lot of like spiritual like symbolism that went into it, and everyone kind of rallied together, and it worked pretty well. A lot of people were like pillaged and thieved from along the way, but setting that aside, everything went pretty well. They got the Holy Land back. Now, unfortunately for Europe, the Second Crusade was definitely not nearly as successful. In 1147, Pope Eugene III called for the Second Crusade in response to an attack in Edessa by a group of Muslims. But the majority of all the crusaders that were sent out were quelled by the Seljuk Turks, the same group who defeated Byzantium in the Battle of Manzikert earlier. So the Third Crusade was more successful than the Second Crusade, but it didn't actually accomplish what it was trying to accomplish. But the big takeaway was that we had three major kings from Europe attending this time. So we had Philip II of France, we had Richard Lionheart I of England, and then we had Frederick I, the Holy Roman Emperor. So in 1189, Pope Gregory called for the Third Crusade in response to Saladin of Egypt retaking the Holy Land. And the forces of the Crusaders weren't really able to retake the Holy Land in any way. It kind of went to a stalemate where Richard Lionheart and Saladin kind of were just butting heads, and they were both very good at what they were doing, but the Crusaders weren't really making any progress. So Richard wanted to go to Egypt and kind of take over the Holy Lands after they had conquered Egypt to make it an easier way to go about it. But no one was really interested, and the crusade ended in 1192, and in that same year, Saladin actually died. So another major thing that came out of the Third Crusade was this idea of Egypt being an enemy. And the Fourth Crusade actually sought to do what Richard Lionheart wanted to do to begin with, which was to go take over Egypt or sack Egypt and then come back and then take over the Holy Lands. But this crusade just went horrible, like just so bad. They attacked more Christians trying to get to Egypt than they actually attacked like Egypts or Muslims. It was so bad that the Pope actually just excommunicated the majority of the people who left on the crusade. So now we're going to move into the late Middle Ages, which is going to be from around 1350 to 1500. And Europe, in the aftermath of the Crusades, it's not looking good. They're really struggling, honestly. The By the time the 1300s roll around, Europe is highly overpopulated. They're struck with famine and economic crisis like throughout. Everyone's lacking food, lacking money. They're not expanding. All the resources they dumped into the Crusades were like basically just lost, and everyone was just really struggling. So, if the economic struggle and overpopulation wasn't enough, in the mid 1300s, we see the emergence of the Black Death. The Black Death historically has wiped out 30 to 50% of all of Europe's population. Some areas even saw as high as like 90% of their population just wiped out from the plague. While there was just a huge loss of life, we actually saw some favorable conditions come out as a result of the Black Death. A lot of that overpopulation that we had mentioned earlier kind of died down, and we actually saw the standard of living rise for a lot of people. So a lot of the commoners they started eating meat and butter, and they started working more favorable jobs. They had bigger land to work, and we saw a significant decrease in like the idea of serfdom. Now, if you remember earlier, we had mentioned how Byzantium was struggling. They had lost to the Seljuk Turks before the Crusades, and that really sent them into like a state of disarray and economic turmoil. Well, come to like this time period in the 1400s, they never really recovered. The Crusades were meant to kind of like revitalize them and like bring them together, but it really just caused more problems than in the end. Everyone was acting like selfishly, and the Crusades didn't really bear any fruit, or at least not any that anyone wanted to recognize. So, as a result of this, this all kind of comes to an end in 1453, where we see the fall of Constantinople. The Ottoman Empire captures the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and this is where essentially we see the downfall of the Byzantine Empire. So, it's out of this fall of Byzantium that we actually see the end of the medieval era. And starting at the 1500s, we'll see the emergence of the Reformation. And the Reformation is what a lot of historians like mark as the start of the modern era. So I hope you enjoyed this crash course in medieval history. And yeah, thanks for listening.